All right, welcome back to another episode of Inside Gateway. We are off-site today. We are at Tim and Jenny Sauder's house. Tim, let's just rewind the clock a little bit and go back to when you first heard about Gateway Woods. That might have been a little while ago, but
a little.
What is your first recollection of Gateway Woods?
I was a brand new believer, and there was a children's home being built in Indiana, and some of my friends said, hey, we're going to go out there and volunteer this with some of the construction.
Okay.
So it goes back that far to about 1975, 76.
So at that point, were they building one of the houses, or?
Yeah, both oak and hickory were being
Okay.
constructed at that time.
Wow.
There was a whole lot more woods and not much as far as the development of the property was, pretty small by comparison.
So, had you had any experience kind of with, because you're from Illinois, correct? So, had you been to Indiana much at that point?
Hardly at all.
Okay.
No.
Cool. So, coming out really kind of to the frontier here, doing some volunteering. So, what connected with you at that point?
Well, I can go back even before that. I think where the Lord planted the first seeds of this whole thing, when I was an unbeliever in the fall of 1974, I went along with 3 other unbelievers along with a group of Christian men to Honduras.
Okay.
On a service relief trip. There was a kind of cleanup after a big hurricane that had slammed into Honduras. And most of the guys were placed on the plains giving out direct food aid, and a handful of us were sent up into the mountains where this Christian doctor and his wife had a children's home and a nutrition hospital.
Okay.
And I got put there for about 2 weeks, and that was my first experience. About 2 years later, after I had become a believer, I went back there again for 5 weeks. And when I returned to the States, I was resolved, God had given me kind of a call or vision to find a job at a children's home. I didn't have a degree. I had some experience as a scoutmaster, Sunday school teacher, but my first job was at a Christian children's home in Peoria as a single house parent. And so that was like that's kind of the origins of my back at the start of it.
Okay. So, fast forwarding a little bit, then coming to Gateway, what was kind of that opportunity, or what did that look like? Were you married, single at this point?
Well, it's 2 parts. The following summer, they were really short-staffed. They had 2 houses. I and another single Christian man came out to Gateway for the summer, and we were considered, they didn't call it that then, but we retrospectively might have been called the first assistant house parents.
Okay.
Spent the summer here and really got connected with the Leo Church. And then went back to school, degree, bachelor's and master's in social work, worked at another children's home in Urbana, Illinois, and then the opening came up for the administrator.
Okay.
And at first I didn't think I was even qualified. I had the right training, but didn't really have that much leadership experience. And the Lord, long story short, He opened the door and shoved me through, and so we landed here in the fall of 1985.
Okay. Wow. So how old were you at that point?
33.
Okay.
And felt like I really didn't know what I was doing, and I needed a lot of prayer, and thankfully I got a lot of prayer.
Yeah. So in 1985, how many kids did you have at that point?
We had 2 houses, oak and hickory,
Okay.
at that point. Those houses were pretty full. When I got here, we were already short on it. We had no alternate house parents, so the local Leo congregation and some of the board members and their spouses were subbing and
Okay.
providing some time off for house parents.
So did they have any kind of training, or it's just kind of like warm bodies?
Good hearts, warm bodies, willing spirits, and weekends there were perhaps some kids would go home that would lighten the load a little bit. You know what that feels like.
Sure. Yeah.
And I wouldn't say, I think in general, on the average, the kids were maybe not as difficult. There were some who were equally difficult to what Gateway deals with now, but on the average, I would say they weren't as deeply disturbed and challenged. challenging.
Okay. And as always, if you have questions, please chime in. So how is it for your family moving out? Just speak into that a little bit.
Well, first of all, I had a wife and no children at that time. Jenny wasn't all that excited at first. It was a process. I remember after my first interview with the executive committee with the board of directors, and I guess I met with a committee and then with the whole board, and we were driving. I hadn't been hired yet, but I had been interviewed, and we were driving away. I remember looking back over my shoulder at the campus thinking, I think I'll be back. And my wife kind of said something like, I'm afraid we'll be back. And over the next couple of weeks, the Lord just really opened up both of us. And, like any change, all of us, you have to adapt to change, but there was clearly a calling and certainly a need. The Leo Church and the Gateway staff were really welcoming, and our friends back in our home churches and in Illinois were very supportive and really lifted us up in prayer, and we feel like we were just carried in those first years. We moved out not knowing we'd ever have children, and within 3 months Jenny was pregnant.
Okay.
And 9 years later I had 5 kids, so
wow.
Indiana's been good.
So when you moved out, you were executive director or what?
They call it administrator at the time.
Administrator. Okay. So how many staff were?
I think including myself, we had about 8-10 staff.
Okay. So yeah, we're pushing 60-ish now.
Yeah.
So it's amazing to see growth.
And really, we only had one program. It was the residential program. We didn't even have our own counselors at that time. They were contracted.
Okay.
We did have an after-school tutoring program, which was very intense. But really just the education director and the 2 assistant house parents who were usually in that classroom after school. I mean, tedious homework, and all the kids went to public school.
Okay.
Some in special ed, some in regular ed. But they had a lot of homework and needed a lot of supervision with that.
So today, obviously we have some private placement in public. Is that similar at that point, or where were the residents coming from?
As over the years, a big majority came through public agencies, VCS, probation. Once in a while there would be a private placement. Often they would have some connection with our church,
Okay.
direct or indirect. There was a time in the mid-90s when we had over half of our kids were privately placed.
Wow.
And that was kind of intentional. And there was kind of a philosophy of being able to work more closely with families who had not gotten into the system yet and were motivated enough to find help for their child and for themselves. I mean, it really became kind of a team effort. I mean, there are pros and cons with all of that, but they were more likely to be, parents were more likely to be believers, perhaps a little more likely to be still together in their first marriage. Invested that they're willing to put some of their money on the line, but also meant a lot of traveling, family counseling and stuff like that. And there was probably a peak, and then I don't know how the population mixes now, but that was always something that we felt like was important for us to be open to that, especially people who had perhaps local churches that had long supported us but never needed our services. And then there were those situations then where it was appropriate and it was like, okay, that feels like we should serve those folks who served us so much.
Yeah, very good. And I love that Gateway. It's all about families and it's all about honoring God. And that speaks really into it. I think 20, 30 years ago, Gateway was doing that. So it's amazing that it's stuck to those guns.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Any questions, Emily? Okay, so I see the logo on your shirt there, so Gateway Woods. So at this point, it was not Gateway Woods. So talk through that a little bit, why the name change, or what was the necessity behind it?
That was a neat experience, and looking back, I feel like the Lord really led us through that to the right name at the right time. we were called the Apostolic Christian Children's Home on Klopfenstein Road. Try to spell that to someone who doesn't know anything, to spell that over the phone.
We'll try to get that URL. You probably get it.
But also we wanted to take away the stigma of the children's home. The kids have enough issues already. We wanted something that had a Christian implication, something that was simpler, shorter, and that wasn't so narrow at just the children's home, but rather we had already gotten into foster care.
Okay.
And strategic planning had already envisioned some of the other services that now Gateway has. Sure. You know, foster care, home-based, school, you know, other programs, you know, off-site. So it was it was a long process, it was a good one, and the Lord provided a board member who had just gone through this with his family's company, had gone through a whole corporate identity thing, and he really walked us through that. There is kind of a neat story at the end. We'd come up with 3 names. Gateway was one of them, and there were 2 others. Just Gateway, period.
Yeah, okay.
And we floated those names, the final 3, through the houses and the staff members. And at some dinner in Oak House, one of the girls says, Gateway. That's just too cold. Why not Gateway Woods? We have a beautiful woods here, Gateway Woods. And that feedback came back to us, and we said, bingo, that's it.
Nice.
So really it was staff and board driven, but it was also child driven.
Okay.
At the end of that.
Oh, that's really cool. And my background's a lot in logo and brand identity, and honestly, one thing that brought me to Gateway Woods is the name and the brand. Like I was always attracted to it. Just the simplicity of it, but it's got a lot of strength behind it too.
Well, and as we rolled that out, I think it was the summer of '89 at the Gateway sale, and we had in the handout that they do for the auction, where there's always auction, but the first couple of pages explained what was behind it, including the scripture verses that were behind gate and way.
Okay.
The quickest one, there are others, but as straight as the gate and narrow is the way.
Yeah.
And there were others, but that really worked for us. And I also thought, trust and obey. When we become a believer, we go through, in a sense, in a moment of time, we change from being lost to found. Mm-hmm. And when you go through a gate, that just happens in an instant. But the way is walking and living and obeying, trust for salvation, and then obeying God's call to live the Christian life. So those are kind of wrapped around the meaning of Gateway Woods.
Oh, I love it. Emily, do you have a question?
Well, if I remember correctly, we found documents a while ago about like when they were renaming the houses, some of the house suggestions were pretty humorous.
Some of them were kind of humorous or tongue-in-cheek.
How did you guys come up with those names then?
Well, it came from the whole thing of woods. That was our place, so it really made sense to have tree names. Now, tree names in some ways are so generic. You find them on streets and, but it really made sense for us. But we did have to narrow down. We wanted a tree that could natively be found in the area or in Indiana. Preferably one that could be found on campus, and ones that didn't have a negative connotation, so we didn't use walnut. We didn't want kids going to school or saying, well, you're from the nut house. So we had to go through those and kind of do it from a kid's standpoint too, and came up with those names and a background. I think, the first 3 houses, and then we had 3 more names kind of held in escrow, if you will, and those were cedar and pine. There is another one held, and the sign is already made and sitting somewhere in the office called spruce.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So
maybe someday we'll break ground for Spruce House, but
could happen.
at this point we've broken ground for Willow Bridge.
Yeah, you got Willow now.
So speak into that a little bit, and then we can kind of rewind. So because that was probably, you said, strategic planning of kind of off-site. So now we do have Willow Bridge, which is off-site.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's probably been other homes like in Fort Wayne, right? So similar concept.
Actually, Gateways, that most people now wouldn't know. We actually had a home called this Transitional Living Program. It was a rented home in Fort Wayne that we rented from a local Christian man. where we had 2 single women and 3 or 4 girls who were just about out of high school or who were out, didn't have a family to go to, still needed and were willing to submit to some supervision and structure. And could be they were finishing a couple classes but working part-time or working out on their own. It was in Fort Wayne for a couple of reasons. One, to be near transportation.
Sure.
And just to get jobs, all those things. Well, that was actually one of the first ones in the state. Wasn't very big, and there weren't any regulations around that. Some of them were still wards of the state or on probation. DCS would, in some cases, would hold custody until kid was 21.
Okay.
Rarely, but they would still do it, especially if there was a good program and the kid was cooperating. Where that went was, it was always difficult to use the single staff. We weren't that many more years older than some of the girls.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
And so what happened was the foster care program started, and we started looking at married couples who were willing to take an older teenager into their home, and there's already a built-in home that they had, and a built-in committed teamwork with husband and wife, and we found that that was a more effective way to take care of those kids, rather than a bunch of them in the same house, taking one with this family, one with that. And there were quite a few families in our local church and area, including Lynn Stiglitz, Jeff Shoemaker, Jenny and myself, and some others who got foster licenses and did that.
Okay. So these primarily are kids that were still in the system.
Yes.
Okay. So Willow Bridge's biggest difference
Yeah.
is aging out.
But still, the transitioning out was still, there were definitely some similarities in their actual.
Because not every kid
needs
that
and their
leaves the
profile.
residential program is 18 or whatever.
Right.
Sometimes they are, and that's where Willow Bridge comes in.
Or sometimes they go out, they think they're gonna handle it, and they crash and burn and then come back and need something. And that was something that actually goes back to the very first board of directors had a vision, a commitment that they didn't want it to be just 18 and out, see you later, good luck. But there was always a vision of some kind of aftercare, like, okay, if we're really gonna commit to these kids the way a Christian family would to their children, then we need to be there even beyond their official time in our program. And I think Willow Bridge and foster care and home-based and this old transitional living program are a fulfillment of that vision, that commitment to be there.
Very good. So, advancement director was another title that you had, right? So when did that transition happen?
In the winter in 2002, I've had decades of back problems, and my back took a real turn for the worse, and I knew it, others knew it, I just wasn't on my game, and something had to change. Either I had to get better, or I had to get out of the way. Long story short, after taking some time off, reflecting, praying, I really felt like it was time for me to move away from that position. Jeff Schumacher was already the acting director and had lots of experience at Gateway already, and it really was a perfect fit. He came in running a program he was very familiar with. The whole system in Indiana, regulatory-wise, contracts had become much more complex. And I had become the face of Gateway. A lot of people knew me, especially within the Apostolic Church. We had never done really any intentional one-on-one kinds of fundraising.
Sure.
We were ready to do that. It was the right place, the right time to feel like Jeff was definitely the right person for that, and I was the right person to do PR and fundraising. And so that's really how that went. I didn't work full-time. I went from supervising, in a sense, to having the entire staff under my responsibility to having no one.
Okay.
And to be able to focus more narrowly, work closer with board members and so on. But that was kind of how that came about. And Jeff and I just switched offices.
Okay.
And it's not always a good fit for when that happens in some corporation or something. I would say it really worked very smoothly, because I think we were both convinced that the other guy was the right one to take the place, and the timing we were on the same page.
Yeah. speaking from a house parent, like whenever you hand the keys over to the house and you kind of retire, if you will, so we've left, there's always that sense of like, oh, you don't want to do that, but looking back, you're thankful because God's timing is right. So
Yeah.
I'm sure that probably felt a little bit of tension there right away.
Not much.
But, okay.
I mean, maybe it had all worked out, or
Sure.
been all previously processed in the months coming up to that.
Yeah.
And by that point, it was a clear situation and position that we were really content with.
Very good. So looking back then, what is something that God's really kind of shown you, like maybe even when you were working at Gateway, but then since that you can kind of reflect on?
It's a couple lessons. One was, I was a young man, pretty passionate, and I would say one thing that God taught me was patience. It's like, well, this makes sense. We need to do this, and let's do it now. But I also had a board of 10, 11 board members who were my authorities, and in some cases counseling elders.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, let's go. And sometimes you got people whose foot on the gas and some people's foot on the brake, and some people are kind of watching to see which way. And I learned that over time, there's some merit to some patience and caution, but also not losing track of the vision.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And there were times when, looking back, it was best that we didn't jump into something too quickly, but rather we did our homework, did the research, did fundraising, or figured out how the budget was going to go, and so on. And I would say over the years, Gateway has made very thoughtful, strategic planning. When we've launched a program, it seems like it's been the right time. We had the right staff. It was the right thing to be done at that time. And because of all those things, it was effective.
Yeah.
So it was kind of that patience component. There were times I was extremely frustrated with my brothers who didn't see what I saw.
Sure.
And I'm sure they saw stuff, but they were probably impatient with me. It's like, why this guy? Why doesn't he see, the hazards here, or some of the things that need to be sorted through first? Another lesson comes to me. One was just through both positions, being able to travel all around the country and visit a ton of churches from coast to coast, from Oregon to Florida and San Diego to Connecticut, even Japan. The hospitality, the loyalty, the generosity of the people within our church, I came to appreciate, like through my years, or 27 years, we came to appreciate that far more than I ever would have imagined. Things that I look back and that are satisfying to me, one would be just taking an organization, being part of, with some really good help from board members and great staff, being able to move Gateway from a place of kind of instability and really struggling to a solid professional organization with multiple services, pretty highly respected in the Fort Wayne area. And one that was not just short-term service and then move back to your hometown, but one where someone could consider a full-time career in Christian service. That wasn't very common in our church beyond nursing homes back at that time.
Sure.
And I think maybe that and Life Point's success there, I believe, opened up the church to other endeavors too, that it gave them maybe the confidence that, we don't have to be so cautious, that yes, we can move forward and God's going to provide and we can do this. And I don't want to think too grandly about that, but I do think it helped open up other things, and maybe it opened up our denomination to more mission service too.
Yeah.
I mean, Gateway, people who've gone on mission trips, a lot of them got inspired and then came to Gateway. People who've worked at Gateway have turned around after they left and then gone to do some really great things in full-time Christian service here in the States and overseas as well. So it kind of goes both ways on those.
For sure.
Another one that, looking back, and I don't want to make this list too long, but I look back at, I had the opportunity, it was the time to draft a mission, vision, value statement. was very hands-on with that. It was kind of for me, a mountaintop experience. And still had to be accepted by the board, but that was back in, I've lost track of what time, maybe 92?
Okay.
And that it still is what Gateway has and still works.
Yeah.
And at that time, we only had 2 or 3 programs. And it still works. It's inspiring. It's also very convicting. And it was meant to be that.
Yeah, so I had the opportunity to be able to kind of give it a little bit of a facelift. Obviously, the content's still the same.
Mm-hmm.
And we made them and posted them a couple different places, strategic points in the like boardroom and
Sure.
kind of like the landing area.
Mm-hmm.
And then Reginald, when he came in, he's like, "Where do I get one of those?" Like, and so he has one in his office now.
Good.
And he just,
Yeah, I mean, everybody ought to at least have one available. I think there probably should be one posted in every house or every.
yeah, I don't know if they're quite in the houses, but that's
Okay,
something
well,
we
they
could
were.
do.
They're probably an old one with the old graphics.
But that's a good idea. We should get them in the houses. But I just, from somebody kind of like being beside it and not really kind of fresh to me, it was just inspiring to me to see that he wanted that and he believed in it. And that's really what brought him to Gateway. And he wanted it in his office as a constant reminder.
Well, the board started from early on. One of the board members will read the entire thing at the beginning of every board meeting. And it's kind of like reminding us why we're here, what we're going to do, and how we're going to do it in a way that honors Christ.
Very good. So I won't take too much more of your time, but I guess I did want to kind of get your opinion now that you've been out of Gateway for a little bit. Obviously, you're still a strong supporter, and we'll touch base that here in a little bit. But where do you feel Gateway is as far as kind of a health level? Is it in a good place? Do you feel there's different areas where we can work on?
I'm not sure. I'm enough detached that I'm not the best one to evaluate that. Knowing good people and good programs, I mean, I'm very confident, very positive. No family is without its flaws and problems, even though you have the Christmas picture, everybody's smiling, you know. But we all know that's not reality. And so there are issues to work with and challenges and, you know, interpersonal struggles. I mean, we're working with a population that by its very nature is really draining and very emotional. I really like what is happening. It seemed like organically unfolding the whole thing of Willow Bridge. It seems a natural next step. And it seems like God has put the right people, provided the right facility at the right time. There's just a whole bunch of things that synchronized here that really help you feel like God's hand is on it. And yeah, there's always been a concern, a challenge of where do we find the right people at the right time? We've got the experience and the heart and the passion, the relationship, the stability with their walk with God and with other people to really come through and do that. And it's been a cause for constant prayer. Going way back when I first walked in the door, we were short-staffed. Yeah. And that seems to come with the territory. And I believe that God is, in general, stirring up the younger generations more open to consider overseas, relocating and being full-time service. That's there in a way that was really pretty rare in my generation or in my parents' generation within our culture. And that, just in a general sense, gives me all kinds of hope and optimism.
Very good. Do we have any more questions?
How you said earlier that you're kind of detached at this point, but how have you and Jenny managed to stay involved with Gateway now that you're not on staff?
Well, one, we're here and we're local. We developed some relationships with house parents and invite them over to our house kind of randomly. It just kind of happens. Connected with some of the new staff and directors like Reginald or Rob, to be kind of a cheerleader, if you will. I see myself as an encourager from the sidelines. I'll never be disconnected because of those relationships, not only with former and current staff, but also former residents. And some of those are ones that I'm still involved with 20, 30 years later, And usually because they've got problems. In some cases, they spent time in prison, didn't have family or a father figure in their life, and I can fulfill some of that for them. So, and then just being in the same local congregation where the kids are, and but it takes some work to stay on top of things. Plus, as we all know who work there, a lot of the work that Gateway does doesn't happen on campus, so you don't see it there. Mm-hmm. It's out in foster homes and adoption and home-based and those kind of things off campus, and so those are kind of invisible to us who are locally.
Yeah, very good. Well, we got a couple things that you have definitely some ties to. So this CD, Strong Trees Grow Slow, explain this a little bit and then how it's benefiting Gateway.
Well, back early in my Christian life, I had some musical background. My mom was a music teacher. I played and sang in a band before I became a believer. After I became a Christian, God started to inspire me to write original songs. Didn't know sure what was going to happen with those.
Yeah.
But after I married Jenny and into a very musical family, the vision started to take place that we would record an album of original Christian songs.
Okay.
And so, starting very early, right at the beginning of our marriage, worked on that and came out with, back in the old days, an LP.
Yeah.
That looked like this, but it was 1 foot by 1 foot.
Sure.
And, that got distributed through friends and people in youth groups and around locally. Eventually there were cassettes made, and in fact we used to give those, they used to be in the office for whatever somebody wanted to pay. Here's a Gateway, or not Gateway, would say Strong Trees cassette, donation goes to Gateway. And then it just kind of sat for a long time, and I know I should have gotten around getting it on CD, but just like one of those things that was never urgent and just seemed to sit on my to-do list for decades.
Yeah.
Then finally when we got around to it, almost missed the CD era because people are downloading music, and it is available by download, a lot of music services. But was like, okay, well, we had this thing put on the funds to actually get the thing reproduced and the graphics and all that donated. So like, okay, anything that somebody gives for the price of it, whether it's a set price or whatever, we were thinking, well, how we can benefit Gateway from this. So basically that's it. The proceeds from it go to Gateway.
Okay.
And
And
so
we will put a link, not the show notes, but in the post here, where you can buy that CD, and like Tim said, it will go to Gateway. Another opportunity is this very heavy history book here, Turning Lives Around. Speaking to this a little bit, how that project kind of transpired. That didn't happen overnight.
No, I've told people it is like about a 4-year labor and delivery.
Wow.
Lot of labor. I first have to start by giving kudos and thanks to Bruce and Loretta Schaefer. She's my co-author, and Bruce was just the organizer, pusher, cheerleader, prodder, whatever. Without them, this book would not have been completed. It was really a team effort. She did a lot of the research, going back and getting the nuts and bolts, nitty gritty for board minutes and staff reports and all kinds of stuff. And best way to describe my role was to kind of put meat on the bones, give the details, because I was fortunate to be an eyewitness to so much of that over the years, starting before I was an employee, but especially during the years as director. And at one point we thought, well, let's just do kind of a condensed thing once over lightly, and we had done so much work and so much research, and we'd become kind of like historians in that process, that we felt like we really should want to do and complete a true history book that really covers the territory. And yeah, for some historians, a lot of the detail is important. For the average pedestrian, some of the administrative, bureaucratic stuff seems a little heavy and dry.
Yeah.
But it's there, and it's locked down. It's captured. And I feel like it was the right time. I had left Gateway altogether, Loretta was retired and saw this as kind of a swan song, her kind of project or to do before her health. I mean, she's 85 years old.
Yeah.
She was working on this. And so that's kind of what happened. We're again, it's already been several years since this thing ended, and so someone needs to keep on writing. But yeah, looking back, really thankful, satisfied. I feel like, why is it important? I think it's important for people in our church background to understand the history of what our church's organizations do. I think for people who work at Gateway, they need to know where this thing came from. They just arrived now in 2019 or whatever. For me, it's important to know a bigger context for what are we doing, where we come from, why are we here, where are we going. And I think understanding the history, to me, it would be inspiring as it is for me to read church history. Like, okay, these are our forefathers. They went through these things. These were the struggles. These were decisions they made. These were the risks they took. And here's how it unfolded. And now I'm part of that.
Very good. We'll also put that in the post as well, where you can get the history book. Okay, so lastly, I just want to, you mentioned just about the short staffed and always kind of a need. So in general, obviously you weren't necessarily a house parent, but you understand, you worked with them a lot. And that's really our current need, is for house parents to come. How would you encourage somebody kind of on the fence, even because you made that decision to come to work at Gateway? How would you encourage them to kind of through your process or through your experience seeing lots of house parent families come?
This may seem kind of trite in some ways, but it's not at all. I think of the title of the book, Turning Lives Around. Lives will be changed, and a lot of times we who come into this business, into this kind of ministry, think we are here, we're going to help people, we're going to save some people from bad decisions, and we're going to lead them to Christ. The thing that most of us didn't know ahead of time was that we end up being changed by that process too, being brought closer to the Lord, closer to what His work is. And for husbands and wives, it's sometimes some adjustment, but working together as a team. I've heard these testimonies over and over again of how they really, really enjoyed working day in and day out, together as a team with their husband and wife. I think there's something really powerful. There are times when people who've got small children or even teenagers kind of anxious, what kind of effect will it have on them? Almost without exception, maybe without exception, people have testified that this was really good for our family. This was good for our kids. I learned more about parenting. I became a better parent. In some ways, I used to tell people I've spent 20 years taking care of somebody else's teenagers, and now I'm doing my own. I still don't know what I'm doing. But there was, I think there's some real benefits to the whole family to be in that kind of ministry as a team. And you experience that yourself with your kids and others who have had small children who melt the heart of a really tough teenage boy who will get down on their belly and play Legos with a 3-year-old. That's not something that they would do in public school. They'd be too macho and too tough. But I think your children, house parent children, are part of the ministry.
Well, thanks for sharing that. I mean, that, from my own experience, I would echo that. But not everybody, that's not common knowledge necessarily. So thanks for sharing that. So, do you have anything else, Emily?
No, Paul and Leanne Fisher chimed in with a question, but we already talked about that earlier, so we won't revisit that. You'll have to go back and listen to the first part of it.
So, I've really enjoyed this. Hopefully we covered everything. Is there anything you wanted to add? Or?
Oh, wow. I'm sure there's more, but it's fine.
All right. Well, thanks again, Tim, for sending us on this little journey, and we'll see you next time.